Okay, so welcome to the afternoon session, and just to say that don't forget there are going to be some more food reception when we're done with the two talks to usher in the new year. But anyway, so meanwhile, we are very happy to have Lisa Young, and she's going to talk about this amazing result about publicly verifiable delegation from standard assumptions.
Thank you. Is this good? Okay. All right. So this is based on joint work with Yael Talman-Kalai and Omer Paneth. So first, let's return to the classical setting of delegation. Let's say you have a Turing machine computation, M on X, and you just want to know whether it outputs 1 in T steps. But unfortunately, you're a resource-bounded machine. Let's say you're a smartwatch, and you don't have the resources to perform this computation. So what can you do? Well, you can interact with a more powerful machine, hopefully a cloud, who can perform the computation for you and prove that the output is 1. Now, in general, you can have such a delegation protocol involving many rounds of interaction. But in this work, we're actually going to focus just on the non-interactive setting, where we have 2 messages. And so in such a protocol, what we'll have is we'll have the verifier generate a CRS, or common reference string, using random coins. And he'll send over the CRS. The prover will perform the computation and output a proof using MX and the CRS. And he'll send back MX and the proof. And then the verifier will check the proof and output a bit B indicating accept or reject. Now, in order for this delegation scheme to be useful, we'd want it to satisfy certain requirements. So the first would be completeness, right? If the Turing machine computation does actually output 1, then we want the verifier to always accept. And the second thing is efficiency, because remember, we are a resource-bounded machine, so verification should take a lot less time than the time to perform the computation. Otherwise, why even delegate in the first place? So ideally, we'd want verification to take as long as it would take to just read in the inputs. And then lastly, we'd like to have a delegation scheme where there's not too much overhead for the prover. So the time to compute the proof should be polynomial in the time to perform the computation. So with these 2 properties, our delegation scheme seems fully functional, right? We can delegate the computations for Turing machines, and there's not too much overhead for the prover, and verification is very efficient. But the prover doesn't have to always act in this way. So if we have a malicious prover, for instance, we want certain security guarantees from our delegation scheme. So in particular, we want it to be the case that when the verifier sends over the CRS and the prover sends back MX and a proof pi, we want it to be the case that he can't adaptively choose an MX and a pi, such that M on X does not output 1, but the verifier still accepts. So this is the adaptive soundness guarantee we want. We want it to be the case that there's no polynomial time adversary that, given the CRS, can adaptively compute MX and pi such that the verifier accepts with non-negligible probability. So in a lot of schemes, soundness will only hold if the random coins used for verification are kept hidden. So, but unfortunately, in a lot of cases, these random coins are required for verification. So this brings us to the point, a key point in this talk is that in a lot of delegation schemes, it's the case that we can't publicly pass around these secret coins, yet they're required for verification. So we can't have what's called publicly verifiable delegation, where anyone can come up and simply verify computations, even without knowing these secret coins. So these schemes, which are privately verifiable delegation schemes, again, require the random coins for verification, but the random coins can't be revealed. And this won't support applications such as blockchains or cryptocurrencies where you rely on having decentralized verifiers. Basically, the idea is that anyone, anywhere can just come up and simply verify computations. So this is a problem for us if we want to support these applications. So this motivates our work, which is, oh, yes?
What about setup is for public? Is the setup presents a problem?
So yeah, so we'll actually get to that right here. So this motivates us to consider publicly verifiable delegation. And in this case, we have a CRS which is generated by a setup algorithm ahead of time and just fixed once and for all. And we again will have the approver compute a proof depending using the CRS here. And then the verifier will verify using part of the CRS. Now, previous works have considered constructing publicly verifiable delegation. And they've constructed it based on knowledge assumptions or in the random oracle model. And there's been a lot of work in this area. But unfortunately, the caveat with these works is that you don't have an explicit security reduction to base your scheme on. And this isn't helpful if you want to preserve kind of this win-win situation in cryptography, where either your scheme is secure because the underlying assumption holds, or your scheme is not secure. There's an adversary for your scheme, but the adversary can break this underlying assumption. So it seems like schemes that do have explicit security reductions are good because either your scheme works or you can solve a hard problem. Now, works have also constructed publicly verifiable delegation from obfuscation, and there's been a lot of recent work actually in this area. But the assumptions are generally of exponential size and they're not well understood yet. And then lastly, we have publicly verifiable delegation based on multilinear maps. But unfortunately, we don't have any candidates which are sufficient for the particular scheme of Paneth and Rothblum. So in this work, we're going to construct publicly verifiable delegation from a falsifiable assumption on bilinear groups, and we'll get to all of that later. But for now, I also want to just ask, so far I've talked about delegation for deterministic computations, but you could also wonder about delegation for non-deterministic computations, right? So in the deterministic case, the prover's goal is to prove that M on X outputs 1. And in the non-deterministic case, he wants to prove that there's a witness W, such that M on XW outputs 1. And we want the proof to be shorter than the witness length, or else we could send the witness as the proof. But unfortunately, we know that there's a barrier for NP delegation. In particular, any scheme that can support all of NP must have a non-black box proof of security. And I want you to remember this point because it will come up later. But let's return back to deterministic computations for now. So for deterministic computations, our result is that there is a publicly verifiable, non-interactive delegation scheme for any deterministic polynomial time computation, and it will be based on a decisional assumption on bilinear groups. So for now, I'll just mention that the assumption will be on relatively few group elements, and it does hold in the generic group model, and we'll see it explicitly later. And so we're going to achieve this result in 2 steps. In the first step, we're going to construct a publicly verifiable delegation scheme, but we'll be okay with the CRS being long, meaning that it can be polynomial in the time of the computation. And this will be following the blueprint of Paneth and Rothblum, where we construct an encryption scheme that supports weak 0 tests, but we base this encryption scheme on bilinear groups, whereas they base it on groups of multilinear maps. Now, in the second step, we're going to take our scheme with the long CRS, and we're going to bootstrap it to obtain a scheme with a short CRS. And bootstrapping, or the idea of recursively composing your proofs, has previously been used for nondeterministic delegation, but it'll work still in our case because our long CRS scheme will support some nondeterministic computations, actually. So we will, in the end, have a sound scheme for deterministic computations. All right, so step 1, let's construct a scheme with a long CRS. So let me go back all the way back to PCPs. Right, so a lot of you are probably familiar with the PCP theorem, and very informally, the idea is that for any time t computation, you can compute a proof in poly t time and verify it by querying a constant number of locations. And these locations will actually be independent of the actual computation. So once you have this theorem at hand, you might already kind of see an idea for how to get a delegation scheme, right? How can we move from PCPs to delegation? So one thing you might try is you might try just having the verifier send the PCP queries to the prover. And then the prover should be performing the computation and computing its PCP. And then the prover should send back the PCP answers, right? But unfortunately, this isn't secure. And you can see if you look at the proof, for instance, of the PCP theorem, that you can't have kind of this adaptive situation where the prover sees the queries and then computes and sends back answers. So we can't actually, basically, we can't send all of the queries at once in the clear. But the idea is that if each answer only depends on its query, so if A1 only depends on Q1, then we can hope to get a secure scheme. So the heuristic of BMW is to use homomorphic encryption to encrypt each PCP query under a different secret key. And then the prover can homomorphically evaluate the answers under the encryption and send them back. And then the verifier can decrypt these answers and check them as before, just using the PCP verification. So unfortunately, this heuristic it actually doesn't hold in general. It's not secure in general. But the work of Kalai, Raz, and Rothblum does prove that this heuristic is sound for specific PCPs. And for those of you that are familiar with no signaling, these are, the soundness is proved for no signaling PCPs. So this is where we will start. We'll start from the privately verifiable delegation scheme of Kalai, Raz, and Rothblum, and we'll show how to achieve public verifiability by modifying the scheme. So the first thing that you would try is to achieve public verifiability is you would just say, well, why don't I just put the encrypted queries in the CRS? But and now the prover can still compute the answers under the encryption, but how does the verifier verify without the secret key that you needed to decrypt, right? And if you think about it a little more, you would first think that public verifiability would break semantic security of the encryption scheme that you're using. So let's think about an attack here. So let's say that the prover is malicious, and he just wants to know if the first query is 0 or not. And remember, we said before that if the prover knows all of the queries in the clear all together at once, then the scheme can't be secure. That's why we're encrypting in the first place, right? So this malicious prover wants to learn if the first query is 1. Let's assume that we have public verifiability, just some magic public verifiability, publicly verifiable algorithm to use for verification. And now the attack that we could have is that the prover could homomorphically compute the following predicate. If the first query is 0, then I'll put the honest proof. Otherwise, I'll put a random string, right? So he'll compute all of this under the encryption. And in the first, and if the query is 0, he'll be accepted. And if the query is not 0, he'll be rejected. And so it seems like because he could use the public verification algorithm himself, he can learn whether the first query is 0 or not. So it seems like you can't have public verifiability and a semantically secure encryption scheme being used here. But our verification test will actually be independent of the encrypted queries. So here, if you think about this attack, it's implicitly assuming that the verification is going to check an explicit relation between the queries and answers. But our test, our verification test, will be very weak in a sense. It's actually just going to check that the correct homomorphic operations were performed in a way that's completely independent of the encrypted queries. And in this way, we can have public verification while still using a secure encryption scheme in the CRS. So the actual name for this verification, yes. Yes.
So P-star can't actually output an honest proof, right?
Oh, yes. So I'm thinking here of like P-star, he's not trying to convince the verifier of a wrong computation. He'll take an honest computation, like an honest Turing machine computation. His goal here is just to learn the queries.
Basically, this is saying that it cannot be a proof of knowledge. Maybe the prover knows an honest proof but doesn't know the witness. That to break the CRS. Like a barrier towards showing that you can extract a witness, I guess.
Well, it's a barrier to show is that if your goal is just to have kind of black box thing that checks whether the proof is valid or not, it will immediately break security.
Yeah.
Checks like the black box checker.
But this is not breaking security.
Well, so.
I see.
Yeah. So like his goal here is just to learn the queries, because once he has the queries, he can cheat and prove anything to you essentially. Right. So first he's gonna say I'm going to even use honest computations just to learn the queries, and then once I know the queries, I can prove whatever I want to you.
CRS is independent of your computation.
Right. Yeah. Right. So yeah. So our public verification algorithm will be what's called a weak zero test introduced by Paneth and Rothblum. And this is different from the more classical notion of a zero test, which checks whether an encryption is of 0. The weak zero test won't actually check on the underlying encryption, right? Because then we couldn't have this zero test and have a semantically secure encryption scheme. The weak zero test instead will intuitively be checking that the correct homomorphic operations were performed, and we'll see the actual form of the zero test later. It'll be clear that it's doing this in a way that's independent of the queries and the secret key. So we can't have a weak zero test with semantic security. So altogether, now using the weak zero test, the verifier can verify, and we do have completeness for our scheme. So what we need to actually put these ideas to practice is we need an encryption scheme that supports homomorphic operations for the prover and weak zero tests for public verification. Now, there is a construction of such a scheme that relies on multilinear maps, but again, there aren't any instantiations that would make this particular scheme secure. But we show how to construct such an encryption scheme based on bilinear maps, for which there are instantiations. So let me give you an idea of what's going on in our encryption scheme. So our encryption scheme will be working over a large finite field, and a secret key here will just be a random field element. And now to encrypt an L-bit message, we're going to sample a polynomial for every bit of the message, such that this polynomial p sub I passes through the bit m sub I at the secret key. Right, so altogether, we'll have L polynomials. And now you could say, why don't we give the polynomials? Because they seem to already kind of hide the messages. But note that if you give the polynomials in the clear, then we can't have semantic security. For instance, we could factor all the polynomials, and if the ciphertext is actually encrypting the all zero string, if each bit here is 0, then the polynomials will have a common root, right? And that will be the secret key. So instead, our ciphertext is going to contain encodings of these polynomials. So let's just say that we have a polynomial that has coefficients CD through C0. The encoding of this polynomial will be g to the p, where this is the set of group elements g to the c sub d through g to the c sub 0, where g is a generator for a bilinear group. So again, an encoding of a polynomial will be a set of group elements that hide the coefficients of the polynomial in the exponent. So maybe we could have the encryption just be the encoding of all L polynomials here. Because if we're given this, it's not clear how we could factor, right? We know that with group elements, we can only hope to do scalar multiplications and linear operations in the exponent. But would this scheme support homomorphic operations, right? It's not enough for us just to have a secure encryption scheme. We want one that would also support some homomorphic operations. So let's say that the goal is just to compute a simple multilinear polynomial on a 2-bit message. And given just the encoding of P1 and P2, it wouldn't be enough. But note that if we also gave the encoding of P1 times P2, then we can compute using just linear operations the encoding of this large polynomial here. And this could be the evaluated ciphertext, right? And note that at the secret key, the exponent would be exactly the multilinear polynomial we're trying to compute. So our homomorphic evaluation will be the encoding of this polynomial that you can get just by using linear operations. So this seems to work, and indeed it does, even in general. So in general, we're going to denote by this bracket notation the set of all polynomial products where each polynomial has exponent e to the e sub I, where I is between 0 and delta. And if we give the encoding of each product in this set, then we can homomorphically evaluate degree delta polynomials in our message. So again, this bracket notation is actually a pretty large set of polynomials. And if we give the encoding of each such polynomial in this set, then we do have homomorphic operations. For us, we're actually just going to take delta equal to 2 because in our scheme, we're only going to require degree 2 homomorphic operations because our PCP will only have degree 2 polynomials. So this is our final encryption scheme. But note that the encryptions here are quite long because this set has on the order of delta to the L polynomials, right? Delta to the L such products. And our PCP tableau will be size poly t, so our queries are log t in length. And so the CRS will be of length polynomial in the running time of the computation. And this is why our initial scheme is going to have a long CRS. But that's fine for us because our goal just in this first section is just to get a publicly verifiable scheme with a long CRS. Sorry?
You need the ability to publicly check, right?
Yes. It's coming, yes. So we have homomorphic operations. The prover is happy, he can compute his answers, but how do we verify? We need the weak 0 test. So let's just say that our goal is we get back some evaluated polynomial, and we want to check if it's 0 at the message. But instead of checking whether this polynomial actually is 0 at the secret key, we're going to check that this polynomial is 0 everywhere, right? Because this would be a check that's independent of the secret key, so we could hope to do this while preserving semantic security. But this seems very useless, right? A prover that wants to pass this check will just give us g to the 0 and say, here, I'm giving you the all zeros polynomial. So instead, our scheme does something that's a little delicate. What we do is we ask for encodings of several different polynomials, say f sub 1, f sub 2, and so on, such that these polynomials together are equivalent to the f that we're interested in. And so as an explicit example, you could think of f being f1 times f2 minus f3 times f4. We're going to ask for the encodings of these 4 polynomials. And then using the bilinear map, we're going to compute each coefficient of this polynomial. So if you think about each coefficient of f1 times f2 minus f3 times f4, it's just going to be a combination of the coefficients of these polynomials. And using the bilinear map, we can perform a single multiplication in the exponent. So we can indeed check that every coefficient of this polynomial is 0. So we can check that it's the identically 0 polynomial. And again, what we're doing is independent of the secret key. So altogether, we have an encryption scheme that supports homomorphic operations and that supports weak 0 tests. And we prove that this encryption scheme is semantically secure if for any logarithmic alpha and for random generator G and field element S, if we're given the set of elements G to the S to the I times T to the J, for I up to alpha and J up to 2, then it's computationally hard to distinguish if T is a random element or if it's the power of S, S to the 2 alpha plus 1. So again, this is a logarithmic number of group elements, and we're just trying to distinguish whether there's a relation between the field elements encoded in the exponent. So for instance, here I've written out explicitly what this set is, and to kind of oversimplify, but to still give you some intuition for why you would hope for this assumption to hold, note that the only tool that we kind of have here is the bilinear map, right? But using the bilinear map, the only power of S that we can compute is S to the 2 alpha. And so we can't hope to compute a relation between the exponents that would only vanish or have a particular value when t is S to the 2 alpha plus 1. So it should be computationally hard to distinguish between t being a random element and t being the specific power of S. All right, so let's go back now to our delegation scheme. So remember, we have a delegation scheme where the CRS is long, but we have this weak 0 test that can be used to publicly verify. But the question now is, do we have soundness, right? We have a complete scheme, but is it sound? So the proof outline for how we show soundness is we show that if the prover is convincing, then this tableau has a locally satisfiable assignment for any small subset of the tableau that we query. So for instance, if the queries that we have in the CRS are Q1, Q2, and Q3, which correspond to an AND gate in the tableau, and P sends back accepting answers, then the answers must satisfy this AND gate. So that's the first step. And then the second step is actually going from what's called local satisfiability to global satisfiability. So this has been studied in a lot of previous works in the context of not only deterministic computations, but also non-deterministic computations, in particular bounded space computations and RAM computations. And these works show that if you have a tableau that has this local satisfiability property, then you can reconstruct the entire tableau so it's globally satisfied. And if that's the case, then the computation must be true. And this is how you can show soundness for these schemes. So together, if you combine 1 and 2, then our scheme is sound. But I wanted to give you a small taste of how we show the first step. Because in our setting, in the publicly verifiable setting, showing that this tableau is locally satisfiable is actually simpler than one might think. So we're actually going to rely on the fact that we have, again, a public verification algorithm, but we're using a secure encryption scheme. So you can think of the queries in the CRS as giving you a window into the computation tableau. And because it's encrypted, the prover doesn't really know where you're looking in the computation tableau. So regardless of what queries are in the CRS, for instance, if they were Q prime 1, Q prime 2, and Q prime 3, looking at a different window, the prover must still send back accepting answers for the first set of queries or for this Q prime set of queries. And so if he didn't send back accepting answers for, say, the Q prime set of queries, we could use the public verification algorithm to break semantic security, right? Because we could publicly verify and say in the second case, his answers are not accepting, so what's in the CRS must be Q prime. And this breaks the security of the encryption scheme. So we have a way to show local satisfiability, which just depends on the prover being convincing on average for random queries. And this will give us and this will allow us to say that the tableau has a locally satisfying assignment for any set of queries, so for any window that we're looking at. So now, altogether, we have a publicly verifiable delegation scheme. It does have a long CRS, but we're going to show how to bootstrap to obtain a short CRS. So let's say that we're just going to start with a small computation, a computation that's just quadratic in the security parameter. And one idea is that we could divide up this computation, right? So what we're going to do in this setting is we're actually going to be delegating RAM computations so that our configurations are also short. And the idea that we're going to use is we're going to delegate small parts of the computation, and we're going to ask for a proof for each small part of the computation. So this seems promising, but note that if we do this, we're only shaving off a factor of kappa, right, the security parameter. We still end up with a large number of proofs. So it doesn't seem like we've really achieved anything here. For instance, if you wanted to verify all of these proofs, all you've done is shaved off a factor of kappa from the running time of the computation. But the idea is that we can actually ask the prover to verify these proofs himself and to produce a proof for this verification circuit. So here I have in gray the verification circuit, which checks that each proof pi sub I moves from one configuration to the next. And we're going to ask the prover to generate a proof that there exist configurations and proofs that would verify. And now, because verification is efficient, this entire computation is efficient. And so we can delegate this entire computation using a CRS that's short with respect to our overall computation that we're trying to delegate. So in general, we're going to use this bootstrapping idea recursively, and we're going to, in every layer, ask the prover for proofs that there exist configurations and proofs in the layer below that accept, that would lead to verification, right? And this is all using our scheme with the long CRS. And we want to check again that our CRS now is short, right? So our CRS now here consists of a constant number of CRSs, and each is again for an efficient computation because verification is very efficient. So altogether we have a short CRS. And now we just want to make sure that our scheme is sound. And as I mentioned before, we can go from local to global satisfiability, which has been done in previous works. And in particular, for RAM delegations, which is the setting that we're in here, it's been studied by Kalai and Paneth. And their result for RAM delegation applies almost or quite similarly to our setting. But I wanted to still highlight a bit of the intuition for why this scheme should be sound. So again, we're going to think of the sliding windows analogy and rely on the semantic security of the encryption scheme that we're using in the CRS. So let's think about the second CRS here. It gives us a window into any part of this gray circuit computation. And we can think of the first, we can think of the window as first reading C0, the first proof, and C kappa. And if the first proof verifies, then C kappa is correct from C0. But we could also think of the window as looking at the second proof and its two configurations. And if the second proof verifies, then C2 kappa is correct from C kappa. But the important thing here is that C kappa will always be the same regardless of whether we're looking at the first window or the second window. If it weren't the same, this would contradict semantic security, right? because then for these two different CRSs, we would have different configurations. So because of this, we know that by the first proof, C kappa is correct from C0, and then C kappa will be the same when we read it again with the second proof. And so C2 kappa is correct from C0. And so we can use this idea to inductively argue that going from C0 to CT, that this entire computation, that the last configuration must be correct. And so this is just for the second layer, but the same idea holds in all of the later layers. And so together, we can use this bootstrapping idea to still obtain a sound scheme for deterministic computations. And we are, in fact, relying on the fact that our underlying long CRS scheme supports non-deterministic computations, right? Because remember that the proofs here are that there exist configurations and proofs for that verify in the previous layer. So this brings up an interesting point, because we know, hopefully you remember from the very beginning of this talk, that we have the black box impossibility result of Gentry and Wicks, that we can't delegate all of NP, but we do see that in a lot of cases we can delegate some subclasses of NP, including like RAM computations, bounded space non-deterministic computations. So an interesting thing to understand would be how much of NP can we delegate. But for us, I want to give a recap of our main result. Our result is we do achieve publicly verifiable non-interactive delegation for any deterministic polynomial time computation. It's based on this decisional assumption on bilinear groups, which holds in the generic group model and is on relatively few elements. And we achieve this result in two steps. First, we construct the publicly verifiable scheme with the long CRS. We do this by constructing that special encryption scheme, following the blueprint of Paneth and Rothblum. And the security of this encryption scheme is based on the bilinear group assumption. So that's where our assumption is coming in here. And then we take this long CRS scheme and we bootstrap it. Now, bootstrapping has been used in previous works to shorten CRSs. But what's very interesting for us is that we use it here in the non-deterministic setting, but to obtain a scheme for deterministic computations. But this gives us a short CRS scheme for all polynomial time computations. And that's all I have for you.
So in knowledge-based construction, it was very important. You don't care about it, right?
The height of the tree, so it could be larger, but we not. Yeah, we're okay if it's n, for instance, or poly and kappa. Yeah.
Transformation is not really not black. You really have to go into the underlying scheme and analyze.
Yeah. Right. So bootstrapping has been used like in mostly, I think, for non-deterministic computations. But for us, we're able to use it because our long CRS scheme has what you might be familiar with, like a local assignment generator, which is kind of this window that we can look at, because basically we can move around this window and get an assignment for wherever we're looking. And so we do have to use this to get soundness with bootstrapping.
Is there anything stopping, like, so you say that the end result you get is for T, but is there anything stopping you from getting delegation?
We get all of them. Yeah.
Okay, makes sense. Other question is, does this actually like add to what was known for even the prior is it obvious that this kind of bilinear assumption gives you partly verifies your stuff in the old sense? Right? Oh, it also gives you up here. So you're done.
Can you characterize roughly what are the type of NP computations that you can do, or that you need here?
So the exact so the these so for instance these non-deterministic computations are of a pretty special form because here you know that because this computation, the underlying computation is deterministic, you know that if the proof pi 1 here accepts, then C kappa is the correct configuration in some sense. So I think you could, and some researchers have tried to better characterize exactly what non-deterministic languages this captures. Maybe, but I'm not sure it's.
You're asking which
Yeah, but not in generality. What is the property of this thing that makes it work?
So okay, for the long CRS, essentially it's really long CRS. It's really whatever. So we show that the going from if you have a cheating proof or you have a local assigner, it works for NP, all of them. The question is from local to global, right? And that previous works, there was shown for P, it was shown for bounded space NP, whatever. All these kind of cases previous work, you can just use them in the black box because these work kind of work in the black box way. So that's for the long CRS. Now, for the transformation from long CRS to short CRS to work, in the paper we did it for P. But like bound, bound.
No, I understand. But the question is, but you do some specific amount of stuff there, right?
In this, right?
Yeah,
what we did there was like the
right.
delegation, essentially.
So
yes, what is the okay?
Right. I mean, I guess like here you can just think of like here here if you just think of the computation here as just a deterministic computation, we do want to have it be the case that there's kind of like a unique or at least computationally unique configurations for C kappa, right? If there's like multiple C kappas, then we can't say that because pi 1 is right.
Unique witnesses.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
The long CRS1. If you have long CRS for RAM, then you have a short CRS for P.
You have to actually have
Right.
all the protocols that we have privately verifiable. Yes, you can get them.
I think we're a bit